This slide presentation will take you through the basics of how to design a book cover. The book cover is really vital for selling a book. And as you're thinking about book cover design, you want to consider not only the cover, but the back cover and the spine as well, and also the flaps that are on the inside of the book. These are all things that people look at when they go to purchase a book. So the first thing to consider is the image that's going to go on the cover of your book design. You also need to consider typography, and those two elements really need to speak to each other. They have to attract the customer, so it's important to know who the customer is. Who's the target audience that might buy this book? The cover should also give a hint to what's inside. The spine serves a purpose because most books are displayed on shelves with the spine only showing. So it's important for the title to be readable. If the author is a well-known author, that might be something you choose to emphasize. And any other little mini graphics that help someone look at the book, notice it, grab their attention, and make them want to pull it off the shelf and pick it up. The back of the book's important too, but for a different reason. Usually people who are really interested will flip it over to find out what were the reviews of the book, what kind of publicity has it gotten, and they usually want to learn a little bit more about it. So the back cover gives more information. Good book design has good typography, and the elements of the type are not distracting. So generally you want to choose no more than 3 fonts to use total on your book cover design, and you want to decide which type is going to be the title type, which type is going to be the smaller, like name of the author, subtitles, things like that. And then if there is copy, those would be longer extended paragraphs of information. That might be a 3rd font. The size of the fonts varies. Title fonts are usually bigger, 24 to 48 fonts, sometimes as large as 72, depending on the size of the book. Copy fonts are usually between 10 and 12 points tall, and then the sub fonts are somewhere between, usually 18 points, maybe 20, 21, depending again on the size of the book. Photos are design elements, so look at them as shapes. This photo is a great example of the use of shape, including the shape of the actual house point. There's repetition in these photos of triangles and rectangles. So think of the shapes you're using. Think of each element, the type and the photo, almost as shapes that you're arranging. Think of your first project and imagine if that had been photographs and typography. That's the basis of book design. Consider who your target audience is. The content of the book is going to affect who wants to buy it. So Trees of San Francisco, well, if you don't live in San Francisco or never plan to go there, you probably aren't going to purchase that book. Slogans or other attention-grabbing things, kind of a subtitle, the one here called Manglo-Saxon, marvelously mangled meanings for well-worn words. So the subtitle itself is attention-grabbing because it plays around with alliteration, and it gives you a clue to what this book's about. There's not a lot of imagery with it, but that's because the book's about words. So consider, what should you emphasize? What should it look like? The book about the trees they use the color green because trees are green, and so the green squares and rectangles help define what that book is about. So consider, what do you want to emphasize? Is it beautiful photography, beautiful typography, color, shape? Figure out what the buyer would be attracted to, and that's what you should emphasize. There are many different parts to a book. The parts we're going to be concerned with are the front and back cover and the spine. Now on this diagram you also see a part called the joint, which is the fold in the book cover, and it's important when you're designing to think about that fold. That size of that fold can affect the overall size of the cover you create. If you don't properly measure the joint, when you print out your book, it will not be the right size. It won't wrap around properly. Some other elements that you should include in your book design, you want it to look as real as possible. So you do want to consider the flaps. Usually you need to have about a 2-inch flap to fold over and fit on the book. The author information is important too. The ISBN code, you can probably grab a copy of ISBN code online. And then if there have been reviews of the book, you don't have to write these yourself. You can go online and use reviews, and you can use a photo of the author from online. But the rest of the photography for this assignment needs to be your own original photography. So here's just a couple more examples and diagrams of the parts of a book. These get pretty detailed. We're not going to be dealing with all of these because a lot of it has to do with if you were actually making your own book, you would be thinking about these things. But as you design the book cover, think about how a book is constructed because that will affect the cover you create. And here's one more example. It's important that a book is able to open and close. I know that sounds, very basic, but it's true. If your book can't fold closed or it can't fold open, then there's a problem with the way you design the cover. You may want to take just a blank piece of plain paper and mess around with making what's called a dummy, which is sort of like a practice one that plans everything out and make sure that it actually fits your book. Test your measurements. So typography tips. Always use a family of fonts that complement each other. A serif font is usually more readable for longer groups of writing. A serif is that little tiny tail that's on the end of the letters. Sans serif means it has no tail, and usually these types are thought to be more contemporary and have a bolder feel. Script is nice if used in a limited amount, but script is very hard to read. A stencil font looks kind of like graffiti stencils, and it can be interesting for limited use, but you wouldn't want to do the whole cover in that. There should be no more than 3 fonts, like I said. For larger areas, serif fonts are easier to read for copy. Leading, remember, is the space between the lines of type, and kerning is the space between the characters. So usually you want to have at least 2 points, and remember, type is measured in points. So you want to have 2 points between the font size and the leading. So for example, if you're doing a block of copy, you might choose 12-point font, and you would have 14-point leading. So that's written as 12 over 14. 12-12 would be considered full. It's very tight looking. And then 12-10 would be negative. You'd actually have your lines of type would be touching each other. So here's an example of each of those. As you can see, take a few minutes to look at the differences between 12-14, 12-12, and 12-10. And notice also how it looks different if you use a serif font or a sans serif font. The next part of this presentation is about photography, because this project involves your own original photography. These could be photos that you currently are going to shoot, or they could be photos that you've already shot. You may use the classroom cameras to do this, or you may use your own point-and-shoot camera, so long as you're able to upload it to the computer. So in good photography, composition is critical. Lighting is also one of the elements that you control, so thinking about the kind of light in the image that you're shooting. Try to have an unusual point of view. In any artwork, you want to have an unusual point of view. So try to do that. Zoom in on your subject or zoom out if it's something where you want to have a wide shot. Size and texture are important too, showing that size and texture. And then of course the rule of thirds, which we always talk about in photography. An unusual point of view means looking at a subject from an angle or point of view that we normally wouldn't look at it. So on the one on the left, the woman's head is cropped really tightly to the point where all you see is her mouth and her kind of scary bad teeth. It doesn't really tell us a lot about her, although she is wearing kind of fancy jewelry and a fur. The one on the right is zoomed in on a horse in a private area, which I won't say any more about, but different points of view can make a more interesting photo. Size and scale can also be interesting if you enlarge something unusually. For example, the rabbit or the onions at the top are exceedingly big, bigger than they're supposed to be. And then the objects at the bottom are really small objects. In real life, those objects are only a couple of inches, but making them look really large and grand and lighting them in an interesting way calls better attention to them. The rule of thirds is when you divide your space equally in vertical thirds or horizontal thirds. And where those thirds intersect, there is something of interest or something scary like the creepy doll over there. But the idea is that wherever a third intersects, you have put something of importance in the photograph. Alfred Stieglitz was the husband of Georgia O'Keeffe. The hands on the left side with the little thimble on them, those are Georgia's hands. And so Alfred Stieglitz was a master at doing photography and using light. In these images, you see what's called leading lines. The line and movement of her hands lead you up into the space. The buttons up the back of the woman lead you up to her, and the hands at the top lead you in. These are by Ansel Adams, and it's the same idea, the idea of showing light and zooming in on subject and noticing the dramatic creative angles of things. Here are a couple more by him. Another thing to consider when shooting photographs is to have level horizon, making sure you hold the camera level and still. Lastly, you want to zoom in on your subject. If you're shooting photos of people, you might consider framing them with interesting elements. These are by Imogene Cunningham. The three at the bottom are actually self-portraits, and so she has chosen to frame herself with her camera and with reflections of herself. The one at the top, the woman is framed by signage. So think about how can you frame up your person or your shot within the camera. These are some more by Imogene Cunningham, and they show leading lines. The line of the flower leads you up into the space. Edward Weston is another great example of a good photographer, so just take a look at his. You see level horizon, beautiful textures, and beautiful leading lines. There's a couple more. Remember, photographing things that maybe no one else would notice, but you notice and look at them in a beautiful way. He almost takes vegetables and turns them into works of art. Paul Caponegro is another famous photographer. These are both great examples of level horizon. And Harry Callahan, noticing details in the smallest places, architectural details, the portrait of his wife, or the subtle different textures in the leaves, and noticing those textures. So your photograph can be digital or film. If you have film photos and you want to scan them, you can do that. It can be color, black and white, or monochromatic. It doesn't have to have a lot of altering and retouching in Photoshop, but it could. It has to illustrate the book, so it has to somehow help with your book design. You may use more than one photo if you'd like, and you may use a photo of the author from a website. So that one, obviously, you can't shoot a photo of the author. Your book design should be whatever size your book needs to be within reason. You have to include the flaps and the spine and those folds. It can be color or black and white. It really depends on your design and the book content. All of the type has to appear as it would on a real book. The barcode isn't necessary, but it helps make it look more real. You're going to be writing a synopsis, not on the Ning, but on the wiki. And then for critique, we'll actually display the real book with the cover wrapped around it. So please make sure you get a copy of the real book or a book that will fit. You're going to edit the photo in Photoshop, but then place it into an Illustrator layout file. The maximum printable size is 13 by 19, so if your book is going to be bigger than that, you're going to have to find a smaller book and kind of fake it. This includes the folds and everything. Make sure your paper is able to stretch when you do create the folds. Make sure that you're able to copy and paste text from the web to the back of the book. So this would be like the book reviews and descriptions of the author and things like that. Try to make it look as real as possible, but do not copy the book design that currently exists.